Well, welcome everybody. We have a whole bunch of folks here in the room because we get to do that now, which is just absolutely delight. And we've got some folks on Zoom. For those of you who are on Zoom, you got a wonderful message in chat from Tracy Alphonse, who told you if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're not going to be able to put you live on the screen, and Tracy will pass those along. So this is really going to be a treat. Professor Robert Miller was one of our panel members when we were talking about reparations back in March, and we had a program with him and Tracy Prince from the congregation. And to just put it bluntly, Bob just blew us away, and we realized we needed the whole thing. So we invited him back to be able to talk for more than 25 minutes with me fretting over how I was going to share time among our speakers. Let me give you a little bit of his background. Bob is now should I be calling you Professor Robert Miller? No, okay. Bob is a member of the East Shawnee tribe. He is a graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School. While he was in law school, point of personal pride, he was lead law clerk for the United States Attorney's Office here in Portland, Oregon. After law school, he clerked for Judge Jerome Scanlon of the Ninth Circuit. And I suspect it was in that time frame that he got to know Judge Susan Graber from the Ninth Circuit, and that's very important because when I called Bob in March to speak, I was absolutely fearless in throwing Susan's name around, saying, you know, she really wants you to talk. Did I tell you that Judge Graber wants you to talk? And of course, he did the trick, which is exactly how I ended up on the Adult Education Committee. Judge Graber said, Ron, you really want to be on this committee. So there's a symmetry. But Bob was a professor. After private practice, he was a professor at Lewis and Clark University. He got taken away from us to Arizona State University, where he's been a law professor there. He's also the chief judge of the Pascua Yaqui tribe Court of Appeals. He's written many, many books on Indian law. Two of the ones that really fascinated me and are directly related to our talk is the Discovering Indigenous Lands, the Doctrine of Discovery in the English Colonies, and he's co-writer of these. And the other, which he actually has with him today, which I just tried to buy at Powell's, and it's in a warehouse, and they're going to ship it, and I'll pick it up. And I'll sell you that. Okay. That was a shameless plug. It is Native America, Discovered and Conquered. Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark, and Manifest Destiny. And Judge Michael Simon, who's here, actually paid for his copy. It was delivered today, and he told me he's already really enjoying it. So without further ado, I'm going to shut up, sit down, and turn the table over to Professor Robert Miller. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'm sorry I'm going to be stuck to this microphone because I like to wander around the room. You know, that's how I teach class. I'm delighted to be here. I spoke over Zoom, was that about 3 months ago?
Yep. And
gave the 25-minute version. Now you get the 2-hour version. Get comfortable, sit back, and we'll talk as long as you want. And as I heat up with excitement, this jacket will be coming off in just a couple of seconds. How do we do the first slide then?
Just tell me.
Slide.
I will start sharing.
So Ron mentioned that I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. The only way I wrote this book was because in 2002, the chief of my tribe called me and said, we would like to appoint you to the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commission. Well, I was a professor without tenure. I'd only been here 3 years. And I thought, well, this sounds like history. I'm a law professor. I can't help you. And they're like, thank you very much, but I can't be the tribe representative. But then my wife and I talk, and I go, well, I won't be here for the 300th year anniversary. So I better, unless I really, so I better take advantage. So I called the chief back. Is that slot still open? Because I thought about the case I'm going to talk to you about. Johnson v. McIntosh, international law that today we call the Doctrine of Discovery. I knew that Thomas Jefferson knew about it. I know Chief Justice John Marshall writes Johnson v. McIntosh, the first Indian law case, full-fledged Indian law case in United States Supreme Court jurisprudence. And so I thought, well, I'll investigate that. What did Jefferson know? What did Lewis and Clark know? And just maybe you had the same perception I did. Lewis and Clark were two country bumpkins that had been to like the second grade. If you've ever read the journals, they're the worst spellers you've ever seen in your life. William Clark misspelled the word mosquito 26 different ways. That's bad. Now, to be nice, I'm sure you're all knowledgeable of this, that there wasn't really accepted English spelling by 1850. And the dictionary by, is it Samuel Johnson, or what's that guy's name that did the first American dictionary?
No Webster.
So I don't make fun of them. And I will talk to you a little bit today that Lewis, well, Meriwether Lewis, I bet you don't know this, was Thomas Jefferson's private secretary. The two of them lived alone in the White House for 2 years before Lewis went on the expedition. He had been in the army. He begged Jefferson to let him lead this expedition. So he was intelligent, he could write, he was smart. He knew the international law that I'm going to talk to you about today. How the United States gets claimed. Ron mentioned the book that I wrote with Indigenous professors from New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. How us English colonies, how the Doctrine of Discovery was used against Indigenous peoples here. I just finished an article that came out in print about 2 months ago about how the Europeans divided Africa. It was called the Berlin Conference. Von Bismarck called it November 1884 to February 1885. They issued the Berlin Act in February 1885 and carved up Africa based on these same legal principles. So I'm talking about something you're not going to hear about in school. You're not going to learn about it. And America used international law. Maybe some of you remember the big debate whether the Supreme Court should use international law at all. Remember Justice Kennedy, I think, got in quite a bit of trouble, or he got a lot of argy-bargy for citing, was it the case about executing a mentally handicapped person? Is that the case? He looked to international principles, other countries, and he was severely criticized for that. Gosh, American Indian law are all based on the Doctrine of Discovery. See why I need 2 hours? Still on the first slide. Hit the next slide. And I threw in reparations because I thought you wanted to talk. John's the next slide. So this is what's called the Marshall Trilogy. This is the first of 3 Indian law cases written by Chief Justice John Marshall. I've been teaching Indian law since 1993. You start with this case. This canon of what Marshall said in these 3 cases is the law. Almost very little bit of those 3 cases have been changed. They're still the law today. So what did he say? Why do we call it the Doctrine of Discovery? Because of this case. The word discovery, I did a word search, in 2002. It's used like 30 times in this opinion, and not as a verb. I'm not too good at English. Not as a verb, but as a noun. So he was talking about this legal principle. Jefferson, Washington, our founding fathers called it preemption, which I'll explain better later. So this country was settled on discovery and conquest. Next point. What did he do to tribal nations? Well, this is what Johnson v. McIntosh says. And I will use this image when you show up with your cross and your flag. What's every painting of Columbus? What's every painting of Marquette and Joliet and John Cabot along the east coast of America? They go ashore, plant their flag and a cross. Did you folks see about 3 weeks ago that Denmark and Canada only settled their claim to a little island near Greenland called Han Island? They've been debating that since the 70s. Every once in a while, they fly one of their ministers over there. They plant their flag, and they leave. The English left whiskey, and the Danish left brandy, I think, or whatever the Danish like to drink. It became almost a farce and a comedy, but they're claiming it. What believe on the moon?
A flag.
A flag. And who owns all those moon rocks? I know there's a fair number of lawyers in this room. There's a DC Circuit Court opinion about who owns some of the moon rocks that Richard Nixon gave away. He had some of them broken up and put in little plastic lucite paperweights, and he gave 140 some of them away to world leaders. One of them came onto the black market. We don't know how, and the US claimed it back, saying it was ours. So I just go 2,000 from the DC Circuit, Doctrine of Discovery. They didn't cite my book, darn it. I didn't have a book. What happened to tribes? They lost some of their land rights magically because Europeans showed up with their flag and their cross. Ron, I always pick someone in the front row, someone will pick you. I'm gonna come over to your house tonight, Bob Miller flag, Bob Miller religious symbol, and I'm gonna claim that I have some rights in your house. Two things he's gonna do, 911, or maybe he has a gun, right? Because I am surely insane, right? But this is in essence what Europeans did around the world. Now I wanna digress so that you see the modern relevance. So we have Canada and Denmark arguing over Han Island, literally just signed a treaty to settle it about 10 weeks ago, New York Times. Do you guys know what Russia did on August 2nd, 2007? They sent a sub 2.5 miles below the surface, and the sub with the mechanical arm stuck the Russian flag under the North Pole. You know why? 25% of the Earth's known oil and gas reserves are under the North Pole. Have you been following our conflict with China over the South China Sea? What did China do in August of 2010? And China is building islands out there and putting buildings on them and flying in military. We've had some ships sail this close to theirs. We've had some planes sail this close to theirs. Vietnam, Japan, and the Philippines are contesting China that it owns the South China Sea. But China is evoking images of me going to Ron's house. I got ahead of myself a little bit with the story, but the modern day relevance of something as ridiculous as, and in fact, when Russia did that in 2007, the Danish foreign minister said, well, this isn't the 15th century. You can't go around the world sticking your flag and stuff. And yet what was Denmark doing on Island? Okay, next. So tribes, okay, I'm getting too excited telling you fun stuff. Tribes lost some of their real property rights. We're going to define that in a moment. That's what Johnson v. McIntosh said. No payment, no consent, no knowledge. Europeans are now claiming some forms of property rights in Indian land. That's still federal Indian law today, and I'll be showing you that. What else did tribes lose according to the Johnson v. McIntosh opinion? They lost some of their sovereign powers. Now, if they want to sign treaties, they're only supposed to sign a treaty with the with the European Christian nation that discovered it. They're not supposed to trade with any country other than the European Christian country that discovered it. I'll also show you Thomas Jefferson using these very ideas as president, as secretary of state, as governor of Virginia. This was commonly understood international law back then. Now I want you to notice this. 1823, Marshall was Jefferson's like fourth cousin, I think. And they hated each other because Marshall was a Federalist and Jefferson's an anti-Federalist, I guess. He started the Republican Party that I guess, or yeah, whatever. Today is the Democratic Party, I don't know. But Jefferson was still alive for 3 more years after this. He died on the 4th of July, 1826. So I have searched Jefferson's readings. And when I did it in 02, you couldn't do the word search computer stuff. Now I've done it. He does not mention this case. Now you might think, well, okay, what does it mean, Bob? Well, he talked about a lot of Marshall's cases. He disparaged a lot of Marshall cases. And that's one reason he didn't like Marshall, because he was a George Washington Federalist. So I take from the fact that this person who did the most writing in the world with pen and ink and never said a word about this case because he agreed with it. And I'll show you what Jefferson had to say and how he launched the Lewis and Clark expedition, and then Oregon's the country coast. I forget if I have those last 2 slides, but Oregon is what Jefferson was trying to claim and solidify the American claim to the Oregon country. Next, so that's what Marshall wrote. Next slide, please. So like a good lawyer, I read this opinion multiple times, and I know there's lawyers in the room, so the elements, what are the elements of the Doctrine of Discovery? For those of you who don't know, a crime has certain elements. If the government wants to prove you're liable for breaking into a house, they got to prove 3 or 4 things beyond a reasonable doubt to convict you of that crime. If I want to sue you for a tort of negligence, I got to prove those 3 or 4 elements. So as a lawyer, I just thought, well, let's read Johnson v. McIntosh 20 or 30 times, and let's try to see what is the actual constituent elements of this international law. So let's go through these 10. First discovery, the first to show up. That flag and that cross had legal meaning. Every painting you ever see, it says, "Oh, Columbus is thanking God for a safe trip across the ocean." Well, yeah, maybe that's true, but he's also making a claim for safety. Do you know? So what were we taught in school? Oh, he's going to sail off the edge of the ocean. I don't think they believed that back then, because Columbus signed 7 contracts with Isabella and Ferdinand. And he also wasn't only going to find a good price on spices. The spices and going to the Chinas, the Japans, they used the plural, was only mentioned in the 7 of these contracts. The most important provision was, we, and this is a quote, "we will make you the admiral over any lands you require for us," period, close quote. Columbus was going to look for land. He did not think he was sailing off a flat earth. So first discovery was significant. The Russian flag at the bottom, is that a joke today? What will be reality is when you really drill a well there, right? What the US is worried about is, I don't think we have 1 atomic icebreaker. Russia has 5 atomic icebreakers. So if anyone's going to be drilling under the North Pole, oh wait, there's no more ice we can drill, right? Hey, see, there's a sunny side to every problem. Next point. Now, Queen Elizabeth I, remember her grandfather was Catholic, Henry VII. Her dad, Henry VIII, was Catholic until he broke with the church. She's Protestant. She's already excommunicated when she's queen, but she likes the sound of this international law, and that other nations might recognize new lands and places that England might claim. So I think I got just a tiny bit ahead of myself. But anyway, in 1578, when Sir Walter Raleigh, I might have had the date wrong, I might 1587, when Walter Raleigh and some other sir wanted to attempt a colony at Roanoke Island, and that one failed, she sent them forth under a charter promising them rights there if they acquire the land for her. But what she and her attorneys developed as an element of the doctrine is that just sailing there once and putting your flag across it, that doesn't last forever. You have to get back within a reasonable length of time and actually occupy it. Now, I'm going to characterize you in a moment American claims to the Oregon country. This is exactly why President Jefferson targeted Lewis and Clark at the mouth of the Columbia River. Now, where are we in this room? Where's the Columbia River?
That way.
Okay, that way. Well, the mouth is northwest of us. Yeah, okay. They built Fort Clatsop. They stayed there. I'll talk about that even more, but this was actual occupancy of the area. And then the great American fur trader, John Jacob Astor, writes a letter to President Jefferson at the time in 1811, said, "I'm thinking of building a fur post on the Pacific. Oh, maybe at the mouth of the Columbia River." Jefferson writes him back, and quote, "I will give you all the support the executive can provide." He wanted a permanent American post, fort, town, trading post at the mouth of the Columbia River. And I'll tell you in a second why the mouth was more, not finding the headwaters of a river was not important. It was finding the mouth. Next slide. So this is what Jefferson called it. And in July of 1790, Congress enacted the first Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. And they used the word preemption. The federal government has power over Indian affairs, whether a state claims the right of preemption or not. So our founding fathers in that very first Congress were using this idea. Did the states or did the feds have this legal right, this property right, this sovereign stuff? Some cases use the title, a European title. I think there's a few Supreme Court cases that use that word. Next element, please. Native title. Supreme Court uses this, I think, 4 times. I've done the Westlaw search. There are state court cases that use this phrase about 100 times in the US. What did tribes have left over? Now, those of you that don't know property law in the Anglo-American system, we have all forms of split ownership of land. Landlord-tenant, disparate people have rights in that land. The life estate and the remainder person have different rights. And so what the court developed was the idea that tribes still have the right to use and occupy their lands forever if they wish. But if they ever want to sell, I bet you can already guess, who can they sell to? Only the nation that claims this preemption right. We were the first to find you, and we've not sold that property right to any other European country, so you could only sell to us. Jefferson told this to tribes in the White House repeatedly. The Jefferson administration signed 26 treaties with tribes in the 8 years he was president. I've counted them, in 8 of them. This idea, this language, if you ever want to sell, can't sell to a foreign country, can't sell to a foreign citizen, can't sell to an American citizen, you can only sell to the United States. Jefferson was a lawyer, don't forget that. He practiced law full time from 1767 until 1774, when he became, got into politics. You can read books today on his law practice because he kept such good notes. We know what a writer he was. About half of his cases were real property disputes, land disputes. And so obviously he's tracing the title back to how did the Commonwealth of Virginia get it? How did the King of England get it and grant it to the Commonwealth? And so he knew all about Doctrine of Discovery. Next point, called it preemption. We've already mentioned what this is Johnson v. McIntosh obviously said this tribes lost sovereign and commercial rights. Next point. Contiguity. I'd like to, can you jump ahead real fast to the map of the US? You gotta go quite a ways. You gotta go fast, so I'll give you some travel news.
There we go.
Oh, you go 1, 2. Okay, no, next map. Gotta go first.
That's funny, that's not
I know. Ooh, that, we're gonna have fun when we read that one. Well, I should be talking more. Okay, so contiguity. How big of an area could you claim just by sticking your flag across the soil? Take a look at this, folks. What's the shape of the Oregon country defined by? What's the shape of the Louisiana Territory?
rivers.
Rivers. The drainage system of the Columbia River is that entire area up to the very tip of modern day Alaska. Folks, the boundary lines of the United States are governed, and the states themselves are governed by this international law. Look at where California is, the 42nd degree of parallel, where it is today. Look at the dividing line, well, look at us and Washington are just the river. But between Canada, we finally drew the line at the 49th degree of parallel in a treaty James K. Polk signed in 1846. Now, let's see how good you listened in American history class. What campaign slogan did Polk run for office on?
Yeah.
54, 40, or 5.
Do you know what it means?
It was, instead of the 49th parallel, it was the 54th parallel.
And why would the United States claim to the 54th parallel?
Because the Oregon Territory goes up there.
Because of the Doctrine of Discovery and this legal element that I've called contiguity. We were ready to go to war, allegedly, because we claimed we found it first. And Lewis and Clark were part of our legal claims that we made to England for more than 40 years over why we should own clear up to there. Why is Alaska the 54th tip of southeastern Alaska? Because of Russia's discovery of Alaska and its claims and treaties we signed with Russia. Okay, go back as fast as you can, but how interesting. So the western branch of the Louisiana Territory, what we allegedly bought from France, is the western drainage system of the Mississippi River. What did Jefferson tell Lewis to do? Go find the headwaters of the Missouri River. And if you've read the journals like I have, I mean, Jefferson talks, or Lewis writes, pretty poignant story how I am standing astride this mighty river of the Missouri, because he did find the headwaters. And when we get to the map, we'll talk a little bit more about contiguity. Next, thank you very much. Next point. Terra nullius, Latin for empty earth. Europeans said if land has no human beings on it, we're going to claim it. That's not all that controversial, is it? When you and I were kids, what did we say? Finders, keepers, movers, sweepers. And going back to number 2, actual occupancy, what else did we say? Possession is 9/10 of the law. I knew that stuff when I was about 5 years old. I didn't have lawyer parents, but that's property law little kids knew. So not that surprising if it's truly empty. Let me tell you about Australia, folks. The English claimed Australia for over 180 years because they said it was empty of human beings. And that's just not true, as we all know. Aboriginal peoples have been there for 100,000 years is what science is saying now, 60 to 100,000 years. And in 1992, the Supreme Court of Australia, in the Malo case, said terra nullius in Australia is a lie. We cannot perpetuate a lie. We have to correct this. So that, just in my legal career, that happened. How it was stunning. Could Johnson v. McIntosh ever be reversed? Indian tribes talk about that all the time, and we go, oh man, 200 years. It'll be 200 years old next year. And, stare decisis, which I was going to make a joke. I guess you've all read the newspaper. I guess stare decisis doesn't mean what it did when I was in law school. But anyway, okay. Next point. I ran out of room, so I threw two of them together. These are the three C's. Do the next one too. I'll just talk about the three C's. Conquest. Johnson v. McIntosh uses the word conquest many times. And I think it's as an element of the overarching doctrine of discovery. What's funny, the tribes that were at issue in Johnson v. McIntosh, the case had not lost any such war with the U.S. Now, there's always been the law of war. Folks, if there's some international law experts in here, tell me if I'm wrong, but the doctrine of discovery is among the earliest forms of international law. We're going to see in a moment it developed in the 1400s, about the same time that the law of war and the law of the sea. Who could sail on the sea and where could you go? Spain claimed the sea was theirs and other countries couldn't sail it. The Dutch, Hugo Grotius, a famous book, contested that in like 1602. So conquest is talking about, first off, if I do win a military war against you, what do I acquire? Well, under the law of Europe, Queen A beats King B. Queen A gets all the public property of King B, but the private property rights are supposed to be left alone. I suppose just to try to get good relations with the people. But the way Chief Justice Marshall used conquest was the mere fact of Europeans showing up. It's as if I just conquered you and you lose these various property rights. Christianity, I don't have to explain to any one of you, do I, that federal Indian policy since English times and Spanish times have been governed on these are heathen savages. We're going to convert them. And, I'll show you some stuff from papal bulls in the 1400s. This was fully behind the idea of this European Christian right of discovery. Civilization, if you know anything about Indian history in the US and Indian policy, it was to civilize these savages. Congress passed what's called the Civilization Fund in 1821 to educate and help Indians because they're just so savage. How'd they ever live for 1,000 years? I just don't know how they go along without Europeans. Anyway, these are my 10 elements, and this is what I have used to write articles about Spain's claims in Chile, Portugal's claims and colonization in Brazil, and now I just co-wrote this article with a German speaker because she did all the research into the German sources as we looked at how the Europeans divided Africa in 1885. It's called the Scramble for Africa. Most historians call it that. Obviously, Europeans have been trading in Africa since the 1500s, the Portuguese primarily, and the slave trade was going on, of course, long before 1885. But only then did this greed, this scramble, we better claim our place first before Germany does, or before England or France or Spain. So I think I have a map at the very end just to show you for a split second how it was carved up. I want to tell you something. Let me just finish this and then 13 European countries went to the Berlin Conference and the United States. Now, for over a decade, I've been wanting to write this article. I didn't have the time. My German's not too good. I know 2 words. And so, but I just wondered, why was the United States invited to this European conference and how to divide up the African continent? Well, they wanted to hear how the U.S. had conquered the Indians and divided this whole continent, or acquired this whole continent. The American representative was not an official voting member, but he gave several speeches and talked at committee meetings, etc.
I'm curious if private corporations would be able to use the doctrine of discovery. If Elon Musk gets to Mars first, does he own it?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Could private corporations use this international law to claim? Well, I didn't explain Johnson v. Macintosh well enough, it was a private corporation. The Johnson's lessees were people who had inherited shares in a company that had bought land allegedly from Indian leaders, allegedly, in what's now Illinois and Indiana, when it was just the frontier and the old, what we would call the old Northwest, right? They bought those alleged purchases were made in 1773 and 1775. And the reason I emphasize that is there was no United States yet. We organized the Continental Congress in the fall of 1774, but these purchases were allegedly done under English law. And so I think that makes Johnson v. Macintosh even more significant. 1823, 50 years later, took that long for all this controversy to spin out. The companies were bribing some of our members of Congress. They were bribing state legislators. They were trying to get Virginia to ratify. Remember, Virginia claimed all that area in what's really now what we call the Old Northwest. And so the Supreme Court had to decide a case. Really, it was under English law. So that even triple reinforces my argument that this is international law. The U.S. adopted it. Chief Justice Marshall adopted it to decide this case. And the Johnson's lessees, Rabbi, were descendants of the shares of a private company. And the case, do you have to guess who had the preemption? I didn't explain it to you, did I? Macintosh got his land by purchase from the United States after the United States signed a treaty in 1813 with these same tribes that allegedly had sold their land in 1773 and 1775. So you've got a private citizen that acquired their alleged right to look for a private corporation against someone who bought their land from the United States. Who has the preemption power? The United States. This private entity can do nothing. So, Elon, sorry. Okay, next slide. I don't know what's next. See, these slides are interesting because I don't know what's coming up until she gets there. Someone says they can't see the screen we're sharing. It's right there.
I think it's because it wasn't being shared.
Well, I can see it on that. Well, not now because she's got it closed.
There we go.
Okay, I'm going to take you quickly, and there is no clock in here. I'm glad it's 2 hours. Hey, I've given 2 podcasts today already. ASU, we had 716 people on a 2-hour podcast, and I just did another one about the UN and the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and there were 7 attendees. So we got a big crowd here. This is a lot better than the talk on the UN. Where did this idea come from? Now, today we might be surprised, and I told you I'd get hot. Today, we might be surprised to think of Spain and Portugal as world leaders, of what do you call it, foreign exploration, sailing away from the site of land. But starting in the 1420s, Spain and Portugal started to argue over the Canary Islands. They almost came to war, each claiming the better right. Portugal goes to the Pope. Portugal says, give us a papal bull and grant the Canary Islands to us. And in 1434, the Pope at first said no. But now I want you to put yourself in the Pope's position. King Duarte of Portugal sends his attorneys to the Pope and says, well, Pope, if you give us those lands, we will convert those heathen savages and we'll teach them how to make money and use printed money and read and farm because they're just savages. Well, probably none of that was true. But you're the Pope, can you turn down that argument? So the Pope goes, and I think it was Eugenius II, and he says, I grant Portugal the Canary Islands to acquire sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. Any Christian prince that interferes with Portugal's property rights would be excommunicated. Next slide, please. So Spain is cut out of it. I'll let you read that. Now here's where I need water.
Water, we can deal with water.
Yeah, I take these breaks. So Portugal continued exploring down the west coast of Africa. They established the city of Ceuta in 1515. And as they came around the hump, discovering things they wanted to claim the land. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
So Portugal goes back to the Pope. Oh, that's what that's for. I thought it was for holding a mass. So Portugal, look at the Pope issued 3 papal bulls, significant ones, 1452, 1453, and 1455. And look what Nicholas V granted to Portugal. Take all property, enslave anyone. Saracens were Muslims, that's the word they used then, and pagans, enemies of Christ, take everything they got. Wow, these are the papal bulls that people are asking the Pope to withdraw now.
So why did the Pope think he had the right to do that?
The question was why the Pope thought he had the right to do that. I guess, well, here's a good word, chutzpah. Or hubris. Isn't that Greek? Or there's a vulgar English word, like, come on, yeah. God's representative, right? Dominion over the entire, in fact, I didn't elaborate well enough, but that's the other thing that King Duarte told the Pope two decades earlier. I will convert them, it'll increase the size of the earthly flock of the one true church. And so what Pope could say no to that? Did we finish that last slide? So Columbus, Spain was cut out of all these papal bulls. This was all King of Spain. Back then, they were provinces, right? Ferdinand was from Aragon, and Ferdinand and Isabella. Isabella was Queen of Castile. But we call it Spain today. So Spain was cut out of this, and these Catholic monarchs were at risk of excommunication, but they were greedy too. So next slide, thank you. So Columbus goes forward. Hit the next slide, please. If I had this myself, you wouldn't have to get carpal tunnel. I could be doing this. So the moment Columbus finds a couple islands, which I believe is only what he landed on Haiti and what is El Salvador, San Salvador. He kidnaps a couple people. He finds a little gold. He grabs a few fruits. Rushes back to Spain. Oh yeah, remember when you said you'd make me the admiral over any lands I acquired for you? So Spain sends their attorneys to the Pope, who just happens to be a Borgia and a Spaniard that had just become Pope. He issues 4 papal bulls, 3 that are really significant. Intercourse Divina. Look what he grants Spain. You get all lands undiscovered by others. Well, who were the others, of course? Remember, there were indigenous people living there, but they didn't count. They're not Christian. They're savages. They're not European. They don't speak Latin. Next point, please. Also, any lands you will discover in the future if they're not previously discovered. So the race is on to get around the world with your flag and your cross. And the Pope's going to give it to you. Next slide, please. The very next year, he drew this line. Now, if you've studied much international history, there's something called the Line of Demarcation. And you're shaking your head, yes, I had never heard of it, so I guess I went to a bad school.
Mr. Klein in the 9th grade.
Mr. Klein, well, I did go to the 9th grade.
You didn't have Mr. Klein.
The Line of Demarcation, it's called, and look what he ordered. Portugal gets everything to the east of that line. Spain gets everything to the west. Sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. Next slide, please, because this is the map. This is, I think it's the map. This is the line Pope Alexander VI drew around the world. It's called the Line of Demarcation. The dotted line is what he drew. Now remember this BS? Remember this crazy talk that the earth was flat? The Pope drew the line from the North Pole to the South Pole. He knew all about that. I mean, maybe Columbus had convinced him now it wasn't flat. But Portugal objected to that line and said, we will not follow that papal bull. We want to move further west. So see over there on the left, the Treaty of Tordesillas, they signed the very next year. That's a town in Spain and where they signed it. And they moved that line about 500 miles to the west. Notice what country falls on that line now. What language do they speak in Brazil? And what language everywhere else in the New World? Duh. So I've read many things that Portugal assumed there was land down there. They assumed they would. You know, do you remember back in those days, they thought the continents sort of mirrored each other, and wasn't it Captain Cook expected to find some continent, not Antarctica, but to find another continent down there to mirror the rest of the world. But anyway, so they hit Portugal, and that's my Brazil, and that's my article about why Portugal used the Doctrine of Discovery in Portugal. Look at to the east. Once Balboa crosses to the Pacific, Crosses Panama, what does he do? He gets to the west side of the Pacific. He's planting crosses. He's got priests with him singing the Te Deum. He's putting up, they said, the Mass, and he's claiming it for Spain. He literally, it's kind of funny, he's stuck along the beach, got his sword out, ripping bushes, and the whole idea is there's no one here to stop me doing what I want. So I'm claiming it. So he claimed the entire Pacific. And certainly when Magellan rounded the tip of South America in 1521, claimed the Pacific for Spain. So could the map again, please? So they then had to draw the line. So now look at the bottom right, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Zaragoza, and they agreed where to draw the line to the west. Do you folks know that when England first discovered Australia, they only claimed the eastern half because they knew this line of demarcation. They knew that the Dutch had found the west side. 1606, so my wife said, I'm gonna give her some credit, a lot of credit for this. I knew that they had hung pewter plates up when the Dutch went ashore in Australia. This land belongs to Holland, or whatever they were called, the United Kingdoms of Holland. We're walking through that museum, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, right? And Molly goes, well, look at that plate over there. I had missed it. It was the plate from 1616 that the Dutch had stuck on the ground. So when the English first went there, map's gone. Or just,
Go back.
okay, sorry, I didn't mean to sound that. So when the English first land, where does Captain James Cook land? A few miles from modern day Sydney, which, if you know Australia, is on the very southeastern point. Then he sailed all the way north and landed on an island that, guess what they called it? Possession Island, because he was there to take possession. You folks probably don't know this. I wrote a book chapter about this. James Cook used the Doctrine of Discovery through his entire career. His 3 international voyages, the Admiralty ordered him to leave things where he had been to prove he had been there. I'm paraphrasing, but that's exactly what the Admiralty ordered him. And they said, if you find a place that there's no humans, nobody, just claim it and leave objects. If you find humans, ask them for our permission to take them into power. Okay, so where was I going? So yes, and so and there's another. Oh, I didn't finish my James Cook story. Cook's Inlet. Did you know it was named for Captain James Cook? He landed in 3 different places in what's today Alaska. They went ashore, British flag, drank a good English porter, to the king's good health, and claimed this entire area. Today, you can go to Cook's Inlet. I was at this guy's house that funded this book I wrote the chapter for, and across from his house is Possession Point. The word possession. Cook and he sent his men ashore to take possession. And Cook was really smart, folks. Putting your flag and cross in the sand, that's not much proof. The Dutch did those pewter plates. Okay, that's not that big deal. Cook put English coins in jars and buried it. And you can read the Cook's manual, the journal of the log of his voyage. I've read it, most of the pertinent parts. And the men he sent ashore said 10 or 12 natives were watching us, hoist the flag, drink the good porter. And so they waited till the Indians left before they planted the coins. I wonder if the Indians were smart enough to walk over and they go, hey, someone's been digging. I don't know, but it would be something. Russia used to plant bronze plates. They planted 30 numbered plates and Russian crest with that eagle symbol they used back then. They made all sorts of discovery claims in Alaska. That's why the rest of the world recognized that they had the rights to then sell it to us in 1869. Doctrine of Discovery, used by all these European countries, well known. Today, we don't learn about it in school. Today, we criticize Justice Kennedy, I believe it was, for invoking international law. Next slide. And I don't know what time it is. So what time is it and how long? Quarter of, and I only have an hour and 15 more minutes.
Yeah, it's 7:45.
Quarter to 8. That's my bedtime. Okay, England. Well, we better go through this pretty. Would you like me to be done in 15 minutes or what?
Can we go back another 45 minutes to 8:30?
Okay, I can do that. Next slide, please. So England, not a Christian, not a Catholic country, excuse me, but Elizabeth I was, so I was 1587. She was delighted with this emerging international law because she wanted her foreign colonies to be recognized. The other countries, stay out. We found it first, we occupy it. Next slide, please. James I, the charters for our early colonies, folks, had many of my elements of the Doctrine of Discovery. I'm giving a talk in November for a historical society in some town in Rhode Island, so I read their royal charter. James I knew all about this international law and the right of discovery. He didn't use that word, but be there first, claim it, occupy it. Next point, please. He used the elements of religion and antiquity. Look what the English settlers, they thought God was killing off the indigenous peoples with the flu and the COVID and what. James I even mentioned, look at this next point. This is a pretty famous minister from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Look what he said. God is clearing our people to this place. Yikes, that's a little harsh. Next slide, this will keep moving. What was the founder's favorite scripture, folks? I didn't make this up. I've read this by multiple historians of American history. What scripture did our founding fathers like the best? And quote in legislature and stuff. God meant for us to have this area. Look out, you heathens, here we come. Okay. This letter's ugly. I'll let you read it. Hit it 3 times. Okay, stop. Just stop. George Washington was a general at the time. The Continental of the Articles of Confederation Congress asked him for advice. We just had signed a treaty with England to settle our revolution for certain. Our existence as a nation was pretty well settled. England wasn't going to invade us. And so he writes a letter of advice. So I'll let you read that. I don't know how fast you read. I'm not interpreting this, am I, or warping your thinking that Washington was comparing Indians to animals? This is called the savage's wolf letter. That's what historians call it. And look what he said, they are both beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. Now that's a pretty chilling letter from good old George. Wow, now that has nothing to do with Doctrine of Discovery, does it? But I give this talk, I want people to see what the original federal Indian policy was. It is discovery and it is manifest destiny, since that's partly what my talk's about, right? God had intended Americans to take over this whole continent. There's people here, they just got to move, or they got to assimilate, or they got to die out because they're a weaker race or something. Next slide. Next point. This is a statute our very first Congress passed, and I left out the language where they do use the word preemption. This is part of the Trade and Intercourse Act. Can tribes sell their own lands? No, unless it's done at a treaty session held under the authority of the United States. Folks, this is still law today. The statute language is barely changed. Next point, this is just a citation. 25 USC section 177, that is still the law today. You've heard the word trust lands, Indian nations own trust lands. Well, that means the United States is deemed to be the legal owner. The tribe's the beneficial owner. The tribe can neither sell, lease, nor develop that land without the permission of the legal owner, the United States. Citation to authority, Johnson v. McIntosh. Papal bulls, I guess. Next point. Here we get to Jefferson. Next one, please. He's Secretary of State in 1792. He uses the word preemption multiple times. He holds a memorable conversation with Sir George Hammond, the American ambassador to the United States, and they're arguing about what was the old Northwest, because the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Fur Company was still operating in what was now American territory once we signed the 1783 treaty with England. They had agreed to withdraw to what's Canada, and they didn't. They were taking beaver as fast as they could, of course. Jefferson said, you've got to get out of there. Those Indian peoples can only trade with us. And he used the phrase, they are our Indians. Next point. As president, I already mentioned this to you, he told tribal leaders in the White House multiple times, your lands are yours, you can live on them and use them as long as you want, but if you ever want to sell them, it can only be to us. Next point. When Meriwether Lewis goes, well, okay, first off, when he buys the Louisiana Purchase, what'd you learn in the 9th grade? Greatest real estate deal in history. We bought 800 million acres for $15 million, 3 pennies an acre. Lie, false. What did we buy from France? What did France own? The preemption right, the doctrine of discovery power to be the first buyer. Folks, this is like, if you know real estate law, this is like having an option, an exclusive first option to buy someone's property. That's what preemption really is. And that's all we bought from France. We paid them $15 million. There were no French towns. I mean, there was St. Louis, there was St. Genevieve, what was the other? New Orleans was established, but French troops, French military presence, there wasn't. And so what did we buy? So in the summer of 1804, Jefferson goes home to Monticello, uses his own library to try to guess how big the Louisiana Territory was. Now, we all know the Lewis and Clark expedition, but the Jefferson administration sent 3 more expeditions out, attempting to find the boundaries. You know, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, who found Pike's Peak. Isn't that funny that he gets out in Colorado and there's a mountain named after him? He was also sent up the Mississippi River to see how far it went north, again, to claim the entire drainage. An expedition I'll bet you never heard of, Dunbar and Scott were sent by Jefferson along the Red River in Texas. So when we get to the map, we're seeing he was sending expeditions to find out what did I just buy? Or what did I buy the rights to? Because we already know Jefferson knew he now had to buy the actual use and occupancy from the natives who owned the native title. Next slide. He wrote Congress this about the lands west of the Mississippi River, which is the Louisiana Territory. He knew he didn't buy the fee simple absolute title. He said, we got to buy it from the quote native tribe. I used a dictionary from back then that means the same thing as today, native owners. Next point. I already mentioned this. This is interesting. When the Lewis and Clark expedition left Washington, D.C., we had not yet made the Louisiana Purchase. In fact, I doubt you know this, but Madison and Monroe, James Monroe, and Robert Livingston were in Paris attempting to buy just New Orleans. They were authorized to pay $2 million. Because remember, they had closed New Orleans to our shipping for a while. We almost went to war over that. And all of a sudden, Napoleon says, who was it? Talleyrand, is that his man? Buy it all, $15 million. But so anyway, when Lewis and Clark left, Jefferson had gotten passports for them from the French and the English ambassadors. And he, like a good politician, he liked them. He said, oh, this expedition is only about the flora and the fauna. We're just going to map it, and that'll be a great value for all of us. But I'll show you in a moment. Jefferson had 4 objectives for the Lewis and Clark expedition. And the scientific part that we're taught in school, that was the last. The other 3 were geopolitical, territorial acquisition, trade, commerce, money. But here's a letter that he writes to Meriwether Lewis. Lewis, if you know the story, so at the winter of 1803, 1804, they are in a camp just a little ways from St. Louis, waiting for the spring thaw and going to sail up the Missouri as soon as you could sail. And so Jefferson sends in this letter. Passports you got? Those passports you got, you don't need anymore. We purchased the rights of Spain and France, and if Spain claimed them. But look what he still told Jefferson. We're now the sovereigns of that country, but it's subject to the property right of the natives to occupy it. So that sure sounds to me like Jonathan being advertised, 20 some years later. Next slide. There's our map. I don't think we need to say anything again. The Spanish refused to give Lewis and Clark passports because the Spanish suspected that Jefferson was after Spanish territory and the Spanish silver mines. In I suppose what today is Colorado and a little further south. And in fact, the Spanish sent out military expeditions to try to catch Lewis and Clark, and they did catch Zebulon Pike, when he went along the Arkansas River to Pikes Peak, and they held him in jail for about 3 months. He's probably lucky he didn't get executed. Next point. American Manifest Destiny. What'd you learn in school? What does it mean to you today? I'd like to take a poll. I just wonder what Americans even think. I went to the same school as you did. I don't know. We all knew the word. What did it mean? Hit the next 3 keys. This is what American historians, not me. This is not me. This is what American historians say Manifest Destiny is. America's special. It's our mission to remake the world, and we're doing it under God's direction. Now, folks, how many of you remember back to, when was that, 05, we invaded Iraq? Remember, for a short while, there was language like this being thrown around. Evangelical groups were going to go over there and expected just everyone flock to be converted. So it's interesting that, interesting idea. I have 3 more points, I think. We're not the only country to have this kind of chutzpah. Chile calls it the Southern Destiny, because Indian nations were in the way of Chile, connecting northern Chile with the Straits of Magellan. 300 miles there, the Mapuche peoples lived, and they were too powerful for Chile to overcome. But linking up was called Chile's Southern Destiny. You see what Argentina said. You see what Brazil still says to this very day. One of those statements is like from the last decade. Next slide, please. Oh, sell a book. I brought 1 book. That's all I could. That's all I had here for. Elizabeth Furs wrote the Congresswoman, wrote the intro for me. Never thought I'd write a book. Anyway, next slide, please. This might be a photo of our other book. Now, this is the book I wrote with the indigenous professors from Australia, Canada. You can't quite see the whole painting, and that's a shame. A Canadian native gave us this painting, allowed us to use it. This native guy has got a cross stuck in his forehead. And you can see the 3 ships of Columbus, and the painting called 1492. So it's just perfect for our book. I've been talking many hours today. I'm so proud of it. Next slide. There's Africa. If you can read that, you can see, what is it, 7 European countries? Yeah, 7 European countries divided Africa up. The article that I wrote, I focused on East Africa, and I compared how the English governed and claimed and colonized Kenya and Uganda against how the Germans did it in Tanzania. This is kind of cute. I love the movie Out of Africa. You know, she was in Kenya. This is why I picked East Africa. But I want to contrast 2 different countries. So the same article I wrote that you written about how the English and French contrast them in West Africa, etc. The Germans are the 3 black countries. They're black color. Next slide. I'm interested in what's next. Oh, well, I was going to get into reparations discussion now, but I don't. Do you want? What time is it?
You can pass it.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
If there are questions, let's talk now. If I warn you out, let's go drink some water. Something on the table. But any questions, comments?
Catch my breath.
Michael.
From the research that you've done about Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, these were not stupid people. And I know that the Law of Discovery, reading some of your books this afternoon, was really like a way to keep the European countries fighting with each other. And for that purpose, I guess it had some value. But didn't they understand that when they're applying some of these rules for here to indigenous people, similar point with respect to slaves, that what they were saying about all men are created equal, everyone's mental life, everyone's pursuit of happiness, how did they justify that in their own mind? For example, if we were to have a time machine and go back and talk to the real Jefferson and Madison, what would they say if he was explaining independence?
I have no insight on that.
Can you try to summarize?
He was asking just how can we justify, is that the right word? Our founding fathers writing all men are created equal, and yet of course they were slave holders. The only people that could vote in early America were white males that owned property even. Women didn't get to vote till 1920, go on and on. I'm just guessing now, Judge, so That's not worth much. I try to anticipate Supreme Court Indian law cases. I'm a terrible prognosticator. What did Jefferson think when he writes these words? Because he didn't think any man was equal to him. I mean, other super rich Virginia aristocrats. Is that the right word? I didn't say aristocrats. So I don't know how to say that. We justify what we as human beings don't. I suppose slave owners all thought they were great Christian people too. They let their slaves pray on Sunday, right? I don't know. The human capacity for, I think this is from the Bible, man has dominated man to its injury. In fact, is that from Jeremiah? Did I just make that? I know I didn't make it up. It's from the Bible, but where?
Yeah, I just want to respond to that. It seems very clear that during Jefferson's time, they were following so many racialist principles, they didn't consider anybody but white men to be important. So the laws all written around the idea that white men are supreme. So it's not really that surprising that there's that kind of bigotry. Not that it makes it any more palatable for us.
Comment from the audience, just am I characterizing this right? But the white men at the time just couldn't even conceive of other people's rights. That's how they lived. And that's just how manifest destiny, I guess that's how God intended, right? That's a pretty good justification for things you want to do when you say, well, God made me do it. Other questions or comments? I did leave out the 2 slides about how Oregon became part of the United States. And so if I could talk a few more minutes, I don't know.
Sure.
I'm going by memory now. I gave this talk at the Kennedy School, you know, that history club the Oregon Historical Society does. And I talked on so long ago, I didn't even get to use my last 2 slides. Now I don't have them here. There were no more slides, right?
There were 2 more.
Oh, those were the reparations. So, well, then let me tie Lewis and Clark to Doctrine of Discovery and the legal arguments we made to England for 40 years. So John Quincy Adams, I got to know him pretty good writing in his book. While he was Secretary of State, he signed a treaty with Spain in 1819, and Spain agreed to retain its claims to the 42nd degree of parallel south. 1821, he gets a treaty with Russia. Russia agrees to retain its discovery claims to 54th degree north. So now it's only England and us that are arguing over the Oregon country. We signed treaties. So the War of 1812, well, I got ahead of myself again. Here's what happens when I don't have my boats. So how the U.S. claimed the Pacific Northwest, the Oregon country? Robert Gray, an American private trader. He was not a military man, and England argued that against us. But Robert Gray, a sea otter hunter, fur hunter, sails apparently the first European to sail into the mouth of the Columbia River in May of 1792. And he maps it and he announces it to the world. He sails a few miles north up into Canada. He runs into, by then, George Vancouver is a captain. He tells George Vancouver, hey, I just found a mouth of the Columbia. I found a mouth and I named it after my boat. Did you know his ship was called the Columbia Redeviva? So he named the river after his boat. Spain claimed, oh, he found that river clear back in the 1770s. But Spain never mapped it. Spain never told the rest of the world. So we claimed Spain had no claim to it. So now Jefferson knows that within a reasonable length of time, he's got to occupy that site. The first discovery only lasts for a certain amount, a reasonable length of time, is what the case law says. So where were Lewis and Clark targeted? The mouth of the Columbia River. Don't go to Southern California and tan on the beach and party out. Don't go up to Canada and whatever, drink Labatt's beer. Or is that Australia? Moose beer. But go to the mouth of the Columbia River. And they build a fort. Now, how well do you remember the Lewis and Clark story? There's a great discussion. Historians got into the first Democratic vote. They even allowed the slave York to vote, and they allowed the native woman Sacagawea to vote. Should we stay at the mouth of the Columbia River and it rains here like hell? And they about drowned at the Oregon coast. They were stuck there in the month of November, and in 30 days, it didn't rain on 6 days, other than that. Or should we go back up by the Dalles where we see it's dry? I don't believe that's true at all, because Jefferson told them to the mouth. They knew about this occupation, they had to occupy it, so they built a fort. When they leave the fort, folks, they leave a piece of paper in the fort. It's called the Fort Clatsop Memorial. And they give copies to the chiefs that they had gotten to know down there and traded with. They said, any white man shows up, give this to him. So I don't have that slide for the language. But on the back side, it had the name of all 33 people that went with them to the coast, including Sakagawea and her kid, and York the slave. And on the front, oh, I'm going by memory now, it says something like the object of this list. So I don't have to interpret this for you. They told us what this list of the 33 people means. The object of this list is to let the informed world and some civilized person know that this expedition was sent by the U states. They did U apostrophe, the U states, and we crossed the continent and we built this fort here. I think if I was in a trial to prove the Doctrine of Discovery in the Pacific Northwest, that would have been my number 1 exhibit. I'd blow it up really big, you know, put it on those things. Look at what Lewis and Clark knew themselves they did. Lewis had a brand iron with it, folks. Do you know that you can go to the Oregon Historical Society and see it? It's one of the few known relics we know absolutely they took across the continent. It says U period, S period, CAPT period, M period, Lewis. I have scanned the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition pretty carefully. That branding iron is not mentioned until they cross the Rocky Mountains and are now in the Oregon country, this unclaimed area. Now they start branding stuff. When they're at the Oregon coast, where Fort Clatsop is, of course, one day Clark took the 3 best men with him. One of them was Shawnee, like me, George Drouillard. I say George, okay, that's a second. George Drouillard is the 3rd most important person on the voyage. He was half Shawnee. Anyway, it takes him and the 2 Fields brothers, Reuben and Joseph, and they go up the Washington Peninsula about 9 miles, and at a tree, he carves Captain William Clark from the United States, November 9 or 1805. They put a fake metal tree up there that has the same writing on it, but we have no idea where the tree was. But now, folks, was he doing that like Kilroy was here or Bob Miller loved Molly? This was legal work. Like putting, you know, what do we call those things? Surveyors come out and put around your property, and we were claiming the Pacific Northwest. So we found it first. We occupied it first. Robert Gray, May of 1792. Let me tell you a story. I didn't finish that. So he sails further up into Canada, runs into Captain Vancouver. He says, hey, I just found this massive river down here. Vancouver sends Lieutenant William Broughton down there in an extra ship. They sail 100 miles up the river to about where the Sandy River is today. Do you know what Mount Hood's named after? Anybody?
Who's someone on that voyage?
A British admiral. I don't know what, see, Europeans love to name stuff. Lewis and Clark named everything they saw. They ran out of names. Do you know the Marias River in Montana? Anybody from Montana? It's actually the Marias River, named after Clark's cousin Maria. They named because this was part of proving you'd been there. Mapping was part of proving where you'd been, naming things, and of course, ignore native names. Okay, so where am I? So then I already mentioned John Jacob Astor builds Astoria. He sends people, boy, I just read a good book by an amateur historian, but it's a good book, just called Astoria. He sent one expedition around South America and an overland one that tried to copy the Lewis and Clark voyage. The ship got there first, they built a port. The English had been doing the same thing with the Hudson Bay Company. Every year, rowing another couple 100 miles, building trading posts. And they, in June of 1811, they can hear the ocean. And so these voyageurs and Hudson Bay guys are, we have found the ocean. And then look over and go, what the hell is that? What's that American flag doing sailing over there? And so John Jacob Astor had beaten them by 2 months. But we still had probably a superior claim to them. But to have now a permanent occupation with the American flag, right? Now, in the War of 1812, the British took the post. We negotiated with them at the end, give it back. The English were a little slow at giving it back, but you guys are gonna love this. So who had been president by then? I think it was Madison by 1819. He sent American military men out to Fort Vancouver, Fort Clatsop we called it. They changed the name to Fort George. And they took their flag down and let us roll and wave ours, and we took ours down and we left. This is ours, we'll be back. So we argued with them. We signed a treaty in 1818 to share the Oregon country, signed another treaty in 1826, I believe, I don't have my slides, to share the country, and we'll decide in the future. And all this time, letters between our secretaries of state and their foreign minister, they were claiming Hudson Bay Company, Alexander Mackenzie, Francis Drake. You guys know that Francis Drake allegedly landed somewhere around San Francisco in 1579. And what do you think he hung up? A nice plate. This belongs to my gal, Elizabeth, right? And they claimed he had gone clear to the 45th parallel, middle part of Oregon. So when James Cook came in 1778, guess where he sailed to? The 45th degree of parallel on the Oregon coast. And then he starts looking for that Northwest Passage, but making every claim possible. Anyway, see how my story spins all out of control. So we finally, Pope runs for office. I'm going to go to war with England if we don't get it all. We signed the treaty in 46 to draw it at the 49th degree of parallel. That's all settled, no war. But how does it become the Oregon country? How do we absorb it? We haven't signed a treaty with tribes yet. How do we get the right to any land? And in fact, Congress passed an act that I have often thought, there are some people living out here on land they think they own. It's well, you want to be popular, bring some lawsuits against people who think they've owned their land since 1850. The 1850 Donation Land Act by Congress gave anyone who farmed it for 5 years 320 acres for the man, and if you were married, you got another 320 acres for your wife. There are plenty of land claims in the Willamette Valley that date to that 1850 Donation Land Act. So then what, we became a territory, and well, now I don't want to throw out dates without my slide, but of course, Oregon becomes a state on Valentine's Day, 1859. The United States, the reason I said some of those treaties, or some of those land titles under that 1850 Donation Land Act might be dubious, is because the US didn't start signing treaties with the tribes around here, the Grand Ronde, the Silex, the Yakima, you name them, hundreds, dozens of treaties until 1855. And the Congress didn't ratify them until 1859, the Senate. There were other treaties earlier that the Senate refused to ratify. So I think what the US was waiting for was for the Indians to just all die by this, and you'll just get it by default, finders keepers, losers lose. So that's how Oregon became part. That's the Doctrine of Discovery. If somebody wants this, I think I paid $20 for it. You can have it for $19. No, $20. But I appreciate getting to speak here, and I hope this was interesting. Oh, more questions?
You're gonna have some from the chat line too.
I do have one from the chat, yes.
Let's take one here and then.
But I'm just wondering,
Oh.
before you talk about reparations.
We had a whole, you can hear it, you can get it online. We had an hour-long talk that dealt with reparations.
All right.
Talking after we go,
If you want me to spend, Ron, if you want me to spend 3 minutes, I could go through this slide, these last two
all right,
slides.
well, let's hear what's over here.
Okay,
and then-
yes.
So the,
And the question for the audience was if I was going to talk about reparations.
so the question coming in from the chat is, given this comprehensive history, it seems like the Gert and recent Castro Huerta decisions continues this legacy of Euro dominance over tribal sovereignty. Where does that leave tribal sovereignty right now?
The Doctrine of Discovery and Johnson v. McIntosh is still the law. The Supreme Court cites it, all the lower federal courts have to cite it, state courts cite it. Johnson v. McIntosh has been cited by Canadian courts about 70 times, by Australian courts about 60 times, and by New Zealand courts about 40 times. In fact, the New Zealand Court of Appeals, which was their highest court then, cited Johnson v. McIntosh in 1847. The English Privy Council, I don't know much about this, but I think it was the highest court of the English Commonwealth, I think. They cited Johnson and McIntosh about 3 times. 1 time for a case in Canada, 2 times in cases in Africa. It is very influential. It's influential because, I hope I've convinced you, this is international law and has been since the early 1400s. This is nothing new. It's just something we've never been taught. So you mentioned, several of you mentioned sort of the ugly history you don't want to hear about too often, right? But, you know, conquest and war and killing people on purpose with diseases is not very pretty to look at. So we don't teach that too much in school. So that was the, McGirt for you, my 5th book will be out in January and it's on the McGirt case. Justice Neil Gorsuch joined with 4 liberals and wrote the McGirt opinion on July 9, 2020. My wife woke me up and said, I think you guys won that case. And I go, what? Because we even then had a 5 conservative, 4 liberal. And you can't even, what people define as the liberal justices don't always vote for tribal positions. There's a very recent article that says that Ruth Bader Ginsburg only voted for tribes 49% of the time, and Breyer only voted for tribes 39% of the time. Thomas, Alito, and Roberts voted for tribes about 12% of the time. So we don't win too many cases in Supreme Court, but now that Gorsuch is on the court, they won 8 of the last 8 cases. Unbelievable, until we lost this Carlos Huerta case that she asked, whoever asked me, on June 29th. So that was the 2-hour podcast we did today from my law school. The dean of Iowa Law was on it, and one of my fellows profs and I, we were talking about Carlos Huerta. You're about to get up, so I'm done, aren't you?
Yeah, we're gonna cut it out. Bob, this was absolutely fantastic.
Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bob. I wanted to remind all of us, we live in Multnomah County, and the Multnomah were a band of the Chinook. And there are, in this area, were traditional villages of the Multnomah, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, Cathlamet and Clackamas also. So
I think all of those are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde today. William Clark sailed down here as they were heading back to the United States. He sailed down the river and they went through the lodges and met some of the people right here in modern day Portugal.
we have, and there is a museum, the Grand Ronde has a museum down near Salem. And I have not seen it, but it is, but they have a lot of artifacts from the villages that were here and artifacts that are of interest to the tribal members. But I do want to thank you so much, Bob, for coming back to us. But I also want to let you all know that we have another series coming up in the fall. Our theme this year is on free speech and non-conformity. We will learn about how these are grounded, how Jewish texts discuss speech and argument and disagreement and so on. But we're also going to find out about what is free speech, what is protected speech, what is not, who is entitled to restrict speech, and what about hate speech? And what about misinformation, and how does technology and social media play into this as well? This whole series is going to be kicked off with a talk from a really wonderful, distinguished legal scholar, Erwin Chemerinsky, who's Dean of UCLA's Berkeley School of Law.
Can I come? Dean Chemerinsky?
Yeah, it is October 2nd. It's a Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock. And his talk is on the meaning of freedom of speech in a politically polarized time. So I think it's really very, very timely. I hope you can all make it. And we're all grateful to our judge, Susan Graber, for arranging this, but it'll be a wonderful series from fall.
Will it be on Zoom?
It will be We haven't figured that out yet.
I would love to see it,
don't
but
know
I'll
if
be
it'll
in
on
Phoenix.
Zoom, but I know it'll be in person, and we'll have it in the main sanctuary.
There will be that component. So you'll be.
And it
At
will
least
be,
recorded.
I'm sure it'll be live streamed. So, thank you all again for coming, both those who are here and in our Zoom audience. Thank you.